DJ scream, heavy in the streets.
We gon' get it, we gon' get it, we gon' get it. We gon' get it, we gon' get it. Get it in blood. Get it in blood. We gon' get it, we gon' get it, we gon' get it. We gon' get it, we gon' get it. Get it in blood. Get it in blood.
Good rich.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Saints and Appetizers podcast. And I just hope that everyone had a happy 4th of July. Everything went off okay. Talking about the fireworks, and hope no one got injured or anything like that. And just a happy Independence Day. And I spent a lot of it with my family, and it was pretty. I enjoyed it. It was a good time, good times with the family and viewing of a lot of fireworks. But what we have here is we got some appetizers for you, some major appetizers for you. We have another UFC pay-per-view event coming up on Saturday, July 8th, 2023 at 10 Eastern, 9 Pacific time, 10 Eastern, 9 Central time, and that'll be at T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, Nevada, United States, and that is UFC 290, Volkanovski versus Rodriguez. And a lot of people are trying to build this up as the biggest card of the event, biggest card of the year already, biggest event of the year already so far. More is what I would say, because we're only halfway through the year. It's only July, so maybe if this card goes off and has a lot of exciting fights and some just interesting outcomes in this fight happen, decisions. It could be. I guess it could be, because there are some big name fighters on the main card, and there's even some on the co-main event. I guess that's the not the early preliminary card, but the preliminary cards. I guess the fights that are on ABC and ESPN. But I guess because of that, it is a good card. There's a lot of fighters on this card that are notable to me. Because of that, I usually just do the main card, go over the main card, the pay-per-view card. But there's 2 fights on the preliminary card that I'd want to go over first. So let's go over those real quick before we get into the main event, the main card. So this is a light heavyweight bout on the second version of the prelims. And it's the first fight on that part of the card, and it's a light heavyweight bout between Jimmy Crute and Alonzo Menifield. And I'm kind of surprised to see these names at the bottom of the card, but then you kind of go and look at their win-loss records over their last 6 fights, and Jimmy Crute, he's only 2-3-1. With the one being it was a draw with Alonzo Menifield. And I guess Menifield, he was deducted 1 point in the 3rd round due to grabbing the fence. So that pretty much, if you do the math, if you do some mathing there, that would mean that without that fence grab, that you could argue that Alonzo Menifield, without the point taken because of the fence grab, you could argue that Alonzo Menifield would have won that fight, or would have won the fight with the scorecards adding up with that extra point. But that didn't happen, and that fight turned out to be a draw, and that was at UFC 284, February 12th, 2023. So that was this year. This was a couple months, not that long ago, really. Just 4 or 5 months ago, not that long ago. And Jimmy Crute, he has 16 fights fights in his career with 12 wins and 3 losses. And in those 12 wins, he's had five wins by knockout, 4 by submission, 3 by decision, and then he has 3 losses, 2 by knockout, one by submission, and then he has the 1 draw that we were just talking about. And he's just in those 2 wins that he had in the last 6 fights. He got a knockout win and got a submission Kimura win, but he's also been knocked out recently. He's only been knocked out twice in his career, but before the draw with Alonzo Menifield, he had been knocked out by Jamal Hill and Anthony Smith, straight up KO at 1 minute and 48 seconds in the Jamal Hill fight. And then I guess it was just at the very end of the round, he got knocked out by Anthony Smith, and that was at UFC 261, April 24th, 2021, and that was just at 5 minutes of the first round, got knocked out. So that's a little suspect there that he's been knocked out. I guess he must have had a year hiatus after that, because those 2 knockouts came in 2021. So he's got some distance between him and those knockouts, but still, it's something to take note of. He must have been injured for 2022 with something, or maybe he was just taking a break from fighting for a little while because he'd been knocked out 2 times in a row recent in short distances of each other. But so we we hadn't talked about Alonzo Menifield yet here, but we already made the case that he should have probably won the first fight between these 2 if it wouldn't have been for the deduction of the point due to the fence grab. But he has a little bit better of a record in his last 6 fights. He's 4-1-1 in his last 6 fights, and the 1 loss was to William Knight, and that came all the way back on December 4th, 2021. And then he obviously had the decision loss or the draw between him and Jimmy Crute. And he has 17 matches, 13 wins, 3 losses, and the 1 draw. And in the 13 wins, he has 10 by knockout, 2 by submission, 1 by decision, been knocked out once, and has lost by decision twice and never submitted. And then, of course, the draw with Jimmy Crute. And just going off of the fact that these guys already fought and you could have said that he won the first fight, and the fact that he's got 10 knockouts in his career, seems like he's kind of a knockout artist. And Jimmy Crute has been, and I guess couldn't really say it was recently, because it was about at least a year and a half ago since he got knocked out back in December. I was just looking at that, back in December by Jamal Hill, who's I think he's the champion right now, isn't he? Yeah, he's the current light heavyweight champion. So that's something to note as well, that the last person he got beat by and knocked out by is currently the light heavyweight champion. So, but that's something. But I'm just going to go off the fact that he's been knocked out twice. He's had a bit of a string of being knocked out. He technically probably should have lost to Alonzo Menifield already. So I'm going to go with Alonzo Menifield in this fight. And I can't really say what round I think it'll happen in. I guess if you went off the history of those knockouts, it would be in the first round. But I'm just going to say that Alonzo Menifield is going to win that fight against Jimmy Crute by way of knockout. All right. Then there's some 2 kind of not big name matches in between the main event of the preliminary card. And so it's just a women's strawweight match and a welterweight match. Jack Della Mandela. That's not a huge big name. So I'm skipping to the main event of the preliminary card here, the ABC ESPN version of UFC 290. And this is an iconic matchup just because of who's in it. And well, I guess he's going to be laying down his gloves after this. And we're talking about a legendary fighter and Robbie Lawler versus Nico Price. So, man, if you followed UFC since back in the late 90s, early 2000s, you know about Robbie Lawler. He's been fighting since he was 18 years old. Looking at his age now, I was thinking he was more like 38 years old, but he's 41 years old and has been fighting. I think he's been fighting in the UFC since he was 18 or 21 years old. And I can see why this is his last fight, obviously due to the age, but he hasn't had a lot of success since the loss to Tyron Woodley back in 2016. Since he won the belt, and then he defended it. He won it off of, I'm trying to think, he defended it more times than I thought. So he won it off of Johnny Hendricks, and then defended it against Roy McDonald, and then defended it against Carlos Condit, and then got knocked out. I just never understood this when this happened. You know, he won the belt and then defended it twice, and then he lost to Tyron Woodley. I mean, I never really understood why he never got an automatic rematch there. And I mean, he got knocked out by him, and then turns around, and at the moment during 2017, July 29th, 2017, Donald Cerrone was a pretty hot fighter, and he turned around and beat him by a decision, but still didn't get a rematch for his title, for his belt. You know, no automatic or semi-automatic rematch. But then he had and I guess that was in his last 6 fights. He's only been 1-5. You know, he had 4-fight losing streak, and then beat pretty much a retirement home, hospice house, Nick Diaz. That was September 25th, 2021 at UFC 66. And then lost to Brian Barberina by knockout at UFC 276 on July 2nd, 2022. So a year ago, but that was considered the fight of the night before he got knocked out at 4:47 of the second round. But just with his history and the fact that he's been fighting in the UFC since 2002, I mean, it'd be hard pressed for me to want to pick against Robbie Lawler or just want Nico Price to win. But he hasn't had his luck in his last 6 fights hasn't been much better, because he's only 2-3-1, with the one being against Donald Cerrone, because he was deducted a point in round 1 for repeated eye pokes. Originally was a majority draw, overturned after Price, I guess Price, he tested positive for carboxy and THC. So, you know, so he tested positive for marijuana, I guess you could say. So that's, I mean, it should have just no contest to draw, one in the same essentially. So he's only won two of his last 6 fights, and with his history of fights, he's 23 has 23 fights, 15 wins, 6 losses, and 2 decision or 2 no contest, and 10 of the wins came by knockout, 3 by submission, 2 by decision, and then 4 of the 6 losses came by knockout, 1 by submission, and 1 by decision. And then he had obviously the 2 no contest, and he hasn't he had the knockout. He's had. I almost want to say that this is going to be a decision, win by decision, but just because these are kind of some kind of older, grizzled vets, I find it hard to believe that these guys are going to go 3 rounds. But I find just because of his age, I almost find it hard to say that Robbie Lawler is going to win this by knockout. Uh, we didn't go. So Robbie Lawler has 46 wins, 46 fights, 29 wins, 16 losses, and 1 no contest. And in that out of the 29 wins, he has 21 by knockout, 1 by submission, and 7 by decision. And then 16 losses, he has 4 by knockout, 5 by submission, and 7 by decision. So, I mean, in his 46 fights, he's had only 14 fights go by decision, 7 wins, 7 losses, but the 21 knockouts. But he's been knocked out 4 times as well. So out of that, he's had the 4 knockout losses and the 5 decision or submission losses. So that's 9 losses. He has more. He's been finished more than he's lost by decision, and he has the 21 knockouts. And I wouldn't bet on this fight. Definitely wouldn't. But I want Robbie Lawler to win, and I want Robbie Lawler. If he's going to win this, it's obviously going to be by knockout. He's only submitting the 46, 48 fights. And in his 46 matches, he's only won 1 ever by decision. So I'm just picking. This is more fan favorite than anything. I'm picking Robbie Lawler to win this welterweight bout between Robbie Lawler versus Nico Price. I'm picking Robbie Lawler to win by knockout. So just two of the kind of name brand fights on the preliminary card. I guess I got 2 knockouts right off the bat. All right, so now on to the main card, the pay-per-view. What most people are going to be here for, and it's on the first fight on the card is a middleweight bout between Bo Nickal and Val Woodburn. And this is an interesting fight just because of the fact that both of these fighters are undefeated, I do believe, even though Bo Nickal doesn't have a lot of fights in his career. He's only had 4 fights, but all of them were wins. He has 4 wins, though, and 0 losses. And in the 4 wins, 1 came by knockout, and the other 3 by submissions. And he's 3-0 in the UFC. He has 1 fight outside the UFC, and there are 2 of them are like Dana White contender series, and all 3 of the fights in the UFC came by submission, 2 by triangle choke, and 1 by rear naked choke. And his last fight was a main card, was a UFC. It was a pay-per-view UFC 285 on March 4th, 2023. And that came at 2:54 of the first round, arm triangle over Jimmy Pickett. So yeah, he has 3 submissions, 1 by arm triangle, 1 by triangle choke, and 1 by rear naked choke, not 2 by triangle choke. So he's showing just in that small sample size that he's kind of I guess a submission artist, a ground game specialist. But then it's kind of on a complete opposite of that spectrum. We have Val Woodburn, who hasn't fought in the UFC in any of his professional fights. They've all been combat night, combat pro fights, and he's 7-0 in his fights, and five of those 5 of the 7 wins have come by TKO or knockout, and the other 2, his most recent fights, in 2022. August 19th, 2022, and March 18th, 2022 were both by decision. So he had a little bit of a run of being kind of a knockout TKO artist in his first three fights. But these were combat night events, so they're not a little different than the UFC. Even though his opponent that he's fighting hasn't even had as many fights as him, but just because that it's the talent level difference, and a lot of times people ground game beats just a pure striker, especially a striker that's probably not really that experienced, doesn't have works probably just on his striking and doesn't have a great ground game or takedown defense. And because of that, on this first fight of the main card, the pay-per-view UFC 290 welterweight bout between Bo Nickel and Val Woodburn. I'm going with Bo Nickel to win this fight by submission. Couldn't tell you what exactly round it'll be. I think maybe Val Woodburn will maybe be able to hold him off in the first round due to his striking and his power, and just before he kind of gets a little gas, uses some of that energy up, and maybe he'll be a little nervous for it being his first fight in the UFC. So maybe I would say Bo Nichols gets the submission win in the second round. All right, now on to the second fight of the main card, the pay-per-view. We had, I guess they've already weighed and everything, so this fight is, I guess, trying to see where it says. I'm not seeing where it says, but one of these fighters, this is a catch weight of 158, so one of these fighters must have missed weight earlier, and this is a catch weight bout between Jalen Turner versus Dan Hooker. If I was to guess who missed weight, I would say it was probably Jalen Turner. I would guess. I'm trying to see if I can find. Yeah, so yeah, it is Turner that weighed in at 158. So this is a catchweight bout. Good on you, Dan Hooker, for still taking the fight, even though Jalen Turner weighed in at what, I guess that's 3 pounds overweight. But Jalen Turner has a pretty impressive record over his last 6 fights. He's 3-5-1 in his last 6 fights, and in his last fight, he lost to Mateus Gamrot by split decision. So it's not like he got dominated or knocked out or submitted in his last fight, and that was March 4th, 2023 at UFC 285. And he has 19 fights, 13 wins, 6 losses. In the 13 wins, he has 9 by knockout, 4 by submission, and then in the 6 losses, he has 3 by knockout. He's been knocked out 3 times, never submitted, and 3 by decision. So, I mean, he's a well-rounded fighter. He can submit you on the ground. He can knock you out, standing up, striking. He's a very well fighter. But same goes for Dan Hooker. He's a veteran fighter as well. That fought quite a bit in the UFC, but has had a bit of a rough run. Yeah, he's fought in the UFC since back on 2014, June 28, 2014. So he's definitely a UFC veteran. He probably has a little more seasoning to him than Jalen Turner, but he's definitely not on the upcoming, the rise up, just because of his last 6 fights hasn't been very impressive. He's only 2-4 in his last 6 fights, and all but one of the losses were by stoppages. He's been knocked out twice and submitted by Kimura once in those 4 losses, and he did win his last fight. He beat Claudio Police That was back on November 12th, 2022. And that was TKO body kick. And he's similar to Jalen Turner. He's got well-rounded history. He's had 34 fights, 22 wins, 12 losses, and the 22 wins, 11 have come by knockout, 7 by submission, 4 by decision, and then 12 losses. 3 have come by knockout, 3 have come by submission, and 6 by decision. But just because of the simple fact that he's had kind of a rough go of it out of his last 6 fights, and both of these fighters are very well-rounded. They can knock you out, they can submit you, and that shows in their win-loss record, so that they can do it all. I think it'll come down to who is better standing up, kind of, and see who goes for the takedown first, and see how effective that is once they go for it. I don't know if I see a finish in this fight, but this is a catchweight bout, 158 between Jalen Turner versus Dan Hooker. I'm going to go with Jalen Turner just because he seems to be the more young, up-and-coming fighter. He needs to get his weight under control. He's obviously a big lightweight, but he's only 28 to Dan Hooker's 33, so it's not a huge age difference. But Dan Hooker's definitely has a lot of history in the UFC. Has had a lot of fights in the UFC, so he's a little more veteran, a little bit more of a veteran. But I think he could, we could maybe say his time has passed a little bit. So I'm going with Jalen Turner to beat Dan Hooker by way of decision in this catchweight of 158. All right, on to the third bout of this card. The main card is a middleweight bout between Rob Whittaker versus Dricus du Plessis, and I believe that this is title eliminator. Yeah, this is a UFC middleweight title eliminator fight between these two. And so just looking over Robert Whittaker first, I think it's just kind of knowledge that the only person here recently since 2014 that can beat him is Israel Adonijay. That's pretty much his kryptonite, his kryptonite. I mean, Israel Adonijay is pretty much his kryptonite. And in his last 6 fights, he's 4-2, and the 2 are like I'm talking about are against Israel Adonijay. Israel Adonijay just has his number, but in all the other fights, he pretty much they're not overly exciting fights because those last 4 wins have all been by decision. So he's just wearing on people. I'm trying to see here. 2 of those 4 wins came by 5th round. They were main events. So he just took people into deep water and beat people by decision. So I can't really say he's the most exciting fighter. He hasn't finished anyone since he beat Ronaldo Souza by head kick and punches, TKO, back in April 15, 2017 on a Fox card. So it'd be hard to say that he's going to go in here and get a knockout or get a submission, but he has 30 fights in his career, 24 wins, 6 losses. In the 24 wins, he has 9 wins by knockout, 5 by submission, and 10 by decision. So, I mean, you can see a good number of his fights he wins by decision, and for a lot of them, the majority of them have been by decision recently. And then in the 6 losses, he has been knocked out twice, lost once by submission, and lost 3 by decision. So regardless of who I pick, I'm probably going to pick someone to win this probably by decision. And then on to Dricus du Plessis. He has a bit of a winning streak going on here. he has a 7-fight winning streak going on, and 5 of those he's 5-0 in the UFC. So, and he's getting finishes in these fights. He's had in his 5 fights in the UFC, all but one has been by stoppage. He's had a TKO corner stoppage over Derek Brunson in his last fight, and then he's had some straight up KOs over Marcus Perez and Trevin Giles. And then he had the one decision in July 2nd, 2022, UFC 276. He had a decision win over Brad Tavares. And man, it's hard to pick a fighter like this. You got the veteran, the champion that all he fights is 5-minute rounds or for the belt, and he has 21 fights, 19 wins, 2 losses, 8 by decision, 10 by submission, one by decision, and then 2 losses, 1 by knockout, and 1 by submission, and no decision. So he only has the 1 decision loss. So it's kind of, if I was to pick Dricus du Plessis here, it would be ignorant and uneducated to pick him to win by decision or even to lose by decision almost, because he has 21 fights and has only gone to decision once. But just off of history and out of respect for Robert Whitaker, I have a heart. They always got these young up and coming fighters. He's 29 years old, but I think people forget that Robert Whitaker is really not that old either. It just feels like he's been fighting forever. He's only 32 years old. So I feel as if I was going to pick Dricus du Plessis, I would have to pick that it's going to come by submission or knockout. And if I pick Robert Whitaker, it's going to be a decision win for him. So in this middleweight bout between Robert Whitaker versus Dricus du Plessis, which is a UFC middleweight title eliminator fight, I think we're going to see Robert Whitaker face Israel Zanjay for the 3rd time, because I'm going to go with Robert Whitaker to win this fight by decision over Dricus du Plessis. And I'm interested in if that'll be a 5-round fight, because it's such a big deal. There's so much implications behind it. Right. So finally onto the co-main event. We have a flyweight bout between Brandon Moreno, the champion, versus Alejandro Pantoja, the challenger. And these guys have some history behind them, which was a little surprising once I started kind of freshening up my memory for them, kind of nerding up on them, studying up on them a little bit. So that's interesting, is that Alejandro Pantoja actually is 2-0 over Brandon Moreno. So you could say that this is a trilogy fight. I guess you could argue that one of them was a pay-per-view fight. I'm trying to see where this is. Oh yeah, so it would have been the first fight between them would have been considered an exhibition fight, but still it's got receipts. It's on tape. You go back and see it, especially with how it ended. It was the Ultimate Fighter Tournament of Champions back on August 31st, 2016. So I mean, it was a while back, and that he got submitted by Brandon Moreno got submitted by Alejandro Pantoja by rear naked choke submission at 3:44 of the 2nd round, and that would have been tough 24. round of 16. So he's already lost. Mark up early in his career, both of their careers, Ultimate Fighter careers, tough careers. He already got submitted by him once. And then further down the line, a couple of years in the future, later, a couple of years later, May 19th, 2018. This was just a UFC fight night. Maia versus Usman. He got beat again by Alejandro Pantoja, and this was by decision. And in his last 6 fights, he is 2-4, 1-1, with the one being a decision over Davison Figueiredo, and then the loss was also later was a unanimous decision loss to Davison Figueiredo, and that was back at UFC 270, January 22nd, 2022. And then since then, he won the interim belt by Car France and defended it and unified it against Davison Figueiredo, and both of those were doctor stoppage over Davison Figueiredo and body kick and punches over Car France. So he's showing that he can knock you out and submit you, because how he won the belt off of Davison Figueiredo in the first place was a submission rear naked choke. But in his 25 fights, he has 21 wins, 6 losses, 5 wins by knockout, 11 by submission, 5 by decision, and all 6 of his losses have come by decision. So he's never been finished, and then he has two draws on his record. So that's a very interesting history there between this. I'm looking at, they may not be saying it is, but I'm almost looking at this as a trilogy fight, even though Pantoja's won all through the first 2, but Pantoja, he's 4-2 in his last fights, last 6 fights, and one of those losses, the 6th loss back, actually came against Davison Figueiredo by decision, and that was UFC 240, July 27, 2019, and that was a fight of the night. So these guys got a lot of history. Alejandro Pantoja and Brandon Moreno, they all have kind of a history, that kind of swirls together a little bit. And Alejandro Pantoja has a lot of fights on his career, on his record as well. Kind of similar when you look at it. They line up pretty good with Brandon Moreno. He has 30 fights, 25 wins, 5 losses, and in the 25 wins, he has 8 by knockout, 10 by submission, 7 by decision, and in the 5 losses, he's only ever been stopped. Never been stopped. All 5 fights went to decision, so that's very similar. That really is kind of lines up really well with Brandon Moreno. And in his last 2 wins over Alex Perez and Brandon Royval, they were both finishes, both submissions, one by neck crank and one by rear naked choke. So that's kind of funny how they line up so well, and then they contrast a little bit as well, because their last 2 wins came by knockout. And they never really, they don't win a lot of fights by decision, but if they're going to lose a fight, it's going to be by decision. So I probably caught some heat, being more of a Davison Figueiredo fan during Brandon Moreno and Davison Figueiredo's quadrilogy fight. I was pulling for him, so I was more of a fan, and never really showed any love for Brandon Moreno or never really gained any love, grew any love for him. And just because of I kind of went off of this uh, when it was Davis and Figueroa versus Brandon Moreno that he had the more impressive history over him until like the last fight when Davis and Figueroa got knocked out. I'm kind of looking at that with Pantoja, and both of these guys have a lot of skill. They both have 30 plus fights. They're both I think 30 plus or exactly both 30 fights. Very mixed, very similar. So actually Bannerino has 29 fights, but the way that they're mixed up is very similar. They're they can get the knockout, but they're double digits in submission wins. But uh, one of these guys to lose, they're probably not going to get finished. So just going off of that and going off of the fact that I was, maybe Alejandro Pantoja can pull this one out for Davis and Figueroa. Who knows? Because Davis and Figueroa's beat Alejandro Pantoja. He may get a rematch, maybe win his belt back. So just just off of all of that, I know it was a large spill in the flyweight championship bout between Brandon Moreno, the champion, versus Alejandro Pantoja. I'm going with Alejandro Pantoja to win this by decision. So, trying to think, have I picked any go by submission? Yeah, I picked Bo Nichols versus Val Woodburn by decision. Since then, it's been a lot of uh, a lot of decision bouts here. All right, finally on to the main event fight between it's a featherweight title bout between Alexander Volkanovski, the champion, versus Yari Rodriguez, the intercontinental champion. So he just because even though Alexander Volkanovski kind of only went up a weight class. He went from let's see, went from flyweight. Yeah, he went from featherweight to lightweight when he moved up to lightweight champion to fight for the lightweight champion, and that was only separated by like 6 months or something. So he was, I guess, stripped of his belt momentarily while he went up to fight Islam Makhachev. He went up a weight class, and that would have been UFC 284, February 12th, 2023. A lot of these fighters that are on this card fought at UFC 24. So that's kind of an interesting storyline as well. But yeah, he just for like 5 months he went up a weight class, and I guess he put his featherweight title on hold there for a little while. But yeah, he lost to Islam Makhachev. Not real surprising going up some weight classes to lose to a bigger fighter. Especially one that is well rounded in wrestling, ground game and striking as well. But he didn't get even though he lost that fight by decision, it wasn't like he got outclassed or embarrassed or knocked out or submitted or anything. The fight went to fight of the night, and then before that he was undefeated in his career, or he was on a ridiculous win streak. He's only been beaten twice, so he has 27 fights, 25 wins, 2 losses. In the 25 wins, he has 12 knockouts, 3 submissions, and 10 decisions. And in the 2 losses, he's been knocked out once, and then he has the decision loss against Islam Makhachev. But before that Islam Makhachev fight, he was he was on a 22 fight win streak for the loss at lightweight to Islam Makhachev. And yeah, showing that, with the 12 wins by knockouts, 10 by decision, looks pretty clear that if he's going to beat you, it's either going to be by knockout or it's going to be by decision. So, on to Yari Rodriguez, thinking these two fighters he fought at UFC 284, so he won the interim belt at the same fight same card that Alexander Volkanovski, I guess, put his featherweight championship on hold and then lost to Islam Makhachev. So that's a kind of an interesting storyline. But really, his record, I guess, isn't overly impressive over the last 6 fights. He's 3-1-1, with the one being a no contest against Jeremy Stevens. Lil Heathen, I guess, got poked in the eye and wasn't able to continue. And then in the one loss was against Max Holloway, just a decision loss. And then in the last 2 fights, he beat Brian Ortega. He was TKO due to a shoulder injury at 4 minutes and 11 seconds of the first round. And then he beat Josh Emmett, which I've never been really impressed with Josh Emmett. He's 38 years old and has just been kind of a bit more of what I would call a stepping stone, kind of fighter that top contenders kind of test themselves against. But he finally got his chance to fight for the featherweight championship belt against Yari Rodriguez, and he got submitted triangle choke at 4 minutes 19 seconds of the second round. So he got his chance. He's kind of just a placeholder, would be what I would call Josh Emmett. So I'm just not overly impressed with the last 6 fights or so that he's been in. He's 4-1-1 actually. So he had, before the no contest against Jeremy Stevens, he knocked out Jung Chan Sung with an elbow. But those the fights that kind of set him up to get the Intercontinental Championship, the featherweight Intercontinental Champions, aren't overly impressive, don't really blow me away, because one was due to an injury, and then I'm not the biggest Josh Emmett fan in the world either. So I think my ruling for this fight, so it is pretty clear cut, honestly, with me explaining it like that. So this is the featherweight title bout, which is a unification bout for the undisputed featherweight title, because Alexander Volkanovski, the champion, versus Yari Rodriguez, the Intercontinental champion. And I think I'm going to go with Alexander Volkanovski to actually get the knockout in this fight. So that and unify and make the belt undisputed. So in the featherweight title bout between Alexander Volkanovski, the champion, versus Yari Rodriguez, the Intercontinental champion, I'm going with Alexander Volkanovski to win this by knockout. And I think it'll probably come later in the rounds, maybe in the 3rd or the 4th round. So that's who I have for the main event. So we'll go back over these fights real quick and say who we picked and see if we can remember what we predicted for the outcomes. So in the first bout, and this we kind of got some extra appetizers here because we actually picked a couple fights on the prelim card, the ABC ESPN prelim card. So in the first bout off of that card, we have a light heavyweight bout between Jimmy Crute versus Alonzo Menifield. and I picked Alonzo Menifield to win this by knockout. Okay, and then on the next on that still the preliminary card, we have a welterweight bout between Robbie Lawler versus Nico Price. And I guess you could say that this is a retirement match, a gloves down in the center of the ring match for Robbie Lawler. And just because of that, I'm going with the long time fan favorite guy that's been doing it since 2002. Been doing it for what 21 years, fighting in the UFC. I'm going with Robbie Lawler, and we know the only way he wins a fight is by knockout. He's either gonna win it by knockout, and that's pretty much the only way. He's not gonna submit you or anything like that. He's either gonna win by knockout or probably lose by decision or something along those lines. Rarely gets finished and rarely gets any submission. So I think this is more of a want than what might actually happen. But I'm going with Robbie Lawler to win by knockout. All right. In the middleweight bout between and this is the first fight on the card. We got Bo Nichols versus Val Woodburn, and I'm picking Bo Nichols to win this by submission. And then on to the catchweight bout between Jalen Turner and Dan Hooker. I'm going with Jalen Turner to win this bout by decision. I believe I picked. And, I think I picked him by decision. And then in the middleweight title eliminator bout between Robert Whitaker and Dricus du Plessis. I'm picking Robert Whitaker to win by decision and get another fight against Israel Zanajay. And then in the flyweight bout between Brandon Moreno, the champion, flyweight title fight between Brandon Moreno, the champion, versus Alexander Pantoja. I'm going with Alejandro Pantoja to actually win the belt and get the belt off of Brandon Moreno. And I picked that probably just to be some type of decision win, even though he does have a lot of submissions in his on his record. And then the main event featherweight title fight between Alexander Volkanovski, the champion, versus Yari Rodriguez, Intercontinental champion. I'm picking Alexander Volkanovski to retain and undispute the featherweight title. I think he's going to get a knockout later in the rounds, third or fourth round. But a lot of people have, like I said earlier, billed this as the best card of the year, or I guess you could say that. Like I said, it all kind of depends on the outcomes of the fight. But there are a lot of big names on this card, and I guess you could say just off of a lineup, it's one of the best cards of the year so far. We still got 6 months ahead of us, so don't get too far ahead of yourself with trying to say this is the best card or the best or the most stacked card so far of the year. Maybe so far, but like I've said, seems like every single time when I say a card doesn't look good, it turns out to be great, and when I say a card looks great, it turns out to be bad. But anyways, I think that's all I have for you. So let's get it on, like they say. And can I get a check, please?